Thank you. That was beautiful. As a chronic insomniac, desire to sleep. I wish you would get questions. Yes. Michael.
Thank you both. Wonderful papers as always. But I want to start from the second one, Thangam. Beautifully presented and extremely generative. And I'm trying to, as you were finishing, I was trying to expand and extend your thinking along the lines of temporality and memory. And I see here a connection with a well-known body of thinking from Bergson to Deleuze and to Simondon about pure memory. So I'm thinking that virtuality and actuality is another way of talking about what you're describing. And it always kind of bothered me that when Bergson and Deleuze talk about multitemporality as coexistence, a key problem is how do we live, how can we live with all multiple temporal moments being present at the same time. So one way out, of course, is that dormancy as kind of selective recollection, as gathering, recollecting certain moments from our memory to activate them at any one time so we can continue living, as opposed to having the burden of pure memory and all the different temporal experiences all being present at the same time. So just a comment. Thank you.
Can I jump in just for 1 second? Because I feel like, I'm sort of obsessed with Bergson's cone of memory. And I do think that there's something in I can't really draw it for you, but I feel like he draws this cone and it has these different sort of layers, or what I think of as sort of echelons. And as you go higher up in the cone, I feel like it's kind of the realm of sort of dream or loose memory. And I sometimes think of it as kind of like the night sky when you're camping and you realize that there's a lot more stars in what had appeared to be blank spaces, and that in fact there's a lot more detail there. And so I feel like there's something in dormancy that's kind of like this detail that can resurge. Whereas I think when Bergson at the tip of the cone, things are much more instrumentalized, and it's like the memory that's being used in an immediate sense. So I think somehow there's something in that layering that allows for that temporal differentiation that I feel like maybe you're getting at in a different way. Although I think that there's more richness in what you're doing than perhaps that.
Do you want to answer that, or take Michael again?
Yeah.
Let you answer.
No, I don't think those were questions, and I actually think that Ada should answer all the questions I get, because I love how she thinks, and I think she understands certain things about my paper better than I do yet. So,
Michael, do you want to go?
So I wanted to put these together, but I think I'm going to leave them separate. Thangam, wow, incredible. The question I have is that you hinted that, and actually not explicitly, but said that the dormant, unlike death, can actually work with, apply to something like this, that which is not strictly speaking alive, even though it's a property of life, right? And so you have a volcano, you have a virus, which is somewhere in the middle, right? And you have words and memories. With life, you said that, it tests the environment to know whether to come out of dormancy or not. I'm wondering, with non-life that is dormant, are there some conditions, what may lead, other than an act of agency or a kiss, to this awakening, right? Dilip, you asked for a non-philosophical question. I have one. No. And this is not at all a got you kind of thing. I'm quite curious, especially as someone who might be an anthropologist, right? You gave this talk in English And so you've recontextualized the word, even though you haven't, strictly speaking, maybe translated it.
Mhm.
In the recontextualization, or however you want to put that, right? Obviously, you're transforming it and spreading it differently. So, what is what of meaning then? That's too philosophical. What is
No, go ahead.
what is what happens to meaning? But also, what then is the purpose? What is your politics in carrying the hardness of the word as a calque or something like this? Are you trying to spread its reality so that it becomes more general, as in the case with the German or the English or the French? Or are you trying to disrupt in different ways?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to respond to Michael? Thangam and Dilip.
Ada? Thank you. That's quite a lovely question, and yes, and I guess I would. I guess one can answer in a rather sort of general sense, in a almost sort of theory of language kind of sense, by saying that words and concepts and memories are in a continual struggle with or dialectic, let's say, or dialectic with the dormancy, in the sense that we very often have the experience of using a word or hearing a word and realizing that it's not the right time for this word. Somehow this word cannot be heard, or is not carrying all of the meaning it can carry in this moment. And then there are other times when it does. And I mean, I did write the last section of my paper in a similar sort of spirit to these remarks yesterday, in a kind of dedication to some of what's happening right now as people sort of rise up, however sort of slowly or sort of ineffectually for now, in speaking about the genocide in Gaza, and how they find the words, and sort of and somehow this is a moment where it does seem like a memory larger than their own. A lot of these being young people in the streets of the world, as well as on our campus, young people who seem to preternaturally almost like recover a depth and sort of immemorial inheritance of struggle, and so the vocabulary gets re-enlivened in those moments. So I think, I mean, I'm sure historians have thought a lot about this sort of thing, and the metaphor of dormancy is probably discussed and problematized by historians more than I know. But I think it is interesting to think, even in just pragmatic linguistic terms, about, or maybe in sort of Bakhtinian terms, about a word as sometimes being asleep and in the enunciative act, one would sort of reawaken it.
Right. Actually, that's a good point of entry into the question that Michael raised, because it is about making the word your own, and it is then that it acquires meaning. It is dormant until it's in the mouths and acquires a life in the world. Now, this paper could easily have been presented in Malayalam, right? I mean, but then that would have been neither here nor there for this audience. So the question that you're asking really is that in that process of rendering the dormancy of the word and awakening it in terms of speaking about and laying out the landscape of its meanings and its conceptual entailments, there is a way in which the exposition, right, is something that is being done in English. And indeed, this is what has been done for most theoretically. And so when I work with ideas like difference, or I work with ideas like Dasein and so on, these words exist in their hardness as words in German or in French, but it's in the English exposition that I become aware of them. So similarly, with when I speak about this word, what I'm trying to do is to make you aware of the world that lies behind this word, to theorize the italic, as it were, right? Because very often in a lot of my students write their works, they tend to use words that are in their languages and keep them in italics. They don't free them. They don't kiss them. They don't awake them out of their dormancy. So what I'm trying to do here is to actually kiss these words into life, as it were. Right? And in many senses, the act of doing this is also like the way in which a dictionary awakens the dormancy of a language, or is seen as, right? It is in the conversation between two worlds that the dictionary emerges, right? Where there is the world of speech and there is the world of the text, and the dictionary occupies that space in between, where it awakens for the person who's compiling the dictionary, it awakens words out of their dormancy, whereas in fact they have been alive, right? And that is the whole ruse of colonialism as well, right? You know, where the idea of dormancy is central to the whole history of colonialism, of societies that don't exist until they have been kissed, until they've been woken up from their dormancy. So to go back to that wonderful quote that you used from de Certeau, the hollow places in which a past sleeps, colonialism's ruse is that of the hollow places in which a future sleeps. Right? So,
Tim.
Where where you've just both finished is kind of where I wanted to begin, because I felt that an important question that Thangam asked quite early in her talk, in relationship to the reading of the Perec novel, had these elements been asleep, or had I, or was it something in between, is in a sense sort of answered by that wonderful quote from Bakhtin about language with which Dilip began, which I also love, that passage, that insistence that the word in language is half someone else's, it exists in other people's mouths. In other words, those words that Perec had written were written in a particular historical situation that could not have been, could not have been, in which those real conditions, historical, material, agricultural conditions, could not have seeped into those words. So, so there was in other words, the particular kind of valency of dormancy, it seemed to me to be present in every moment of Dilip's talk also. But I wanted to ask you both about something else, and that is these little moments of sort of political militancy that you both were fascinated by. Thangam in the closing quotation from Certeau, de Certeau, an unknown life surged forth. I wasn't sure of what the situation was that he was describing. I was assuming it was like May '68, but yeah, okay. And then this also kind of extraordinary moment, Dilip, that you didn't dwell on except to sort of frame it very much in relationship to your central concept, and that is the militancy against the BJP in Kerala that was very violent, that has been very violent, but also very effective in a sense. So I wonder whether is there also a dimension of political militancy that that also needs to be kissed back into life? I mean, are we at a moment where some form of, I don't mean stabbing with blunt knives, but some idea of politics as militancy and as struggle and fight could be, and in a way might be reawakened? Is this something Is there something dormant, latent in both of your papers that maybe suggests something of that order?
Dilip, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. I think this is indeed the probably the central political problem of our times. What are to be our forms of action in the world? And over the period of my life, as it were, I have seen the ways in which there has been a deployment of and a hijacking of the ideas that underlay the freedom movement. The ideas of civil disobedience, passive, peaceful agitation, and so on and so forth. And those have been suborned into a neoliberal practice of politics, where neoliberal politics demands a quiescent population. It sets the terms for how human beings can be, what human beings can protest against. So there is indeed a need to awaken forms of political action that require a more militant engagement, right? And in India, this is something that it's only those on the left who have realized this in two possible directions. So one is this, what is happening in Kerala, about which I'm profoundly ambivalent. I mean, I'm certainly no supporter of the murder of individuals in order to get rid of a problem. I mean, this has been part of our political history from very right-wing ideologies as well, to get rid of the opposition. So there's that. But the other thing is that amidst the quiescence of Indian politics, the one force that has stood up against the Hindu Nationalist Party have been the farmers, who exercised forms of agitation which have brought back militancy into the public sphere, right? So driving, I mean, this is something that you know in Paris as well, driving tractors into the middle of the city where the rural hinterland enters the urban and occupies it. Similar such things have been happening in the capital in Delhi. We can think about student agitations, which have happened not more than 2 years ago, which have invited the violence of the state. I mean, it's always violence followed by a counter-violence, and which have moved away from, disrupted the narrative of a kind of arriving at a decent democratic politics, right? And the idea of decency being that of the non-exercise of militancy, exercising udukka within democracy, right? Or here too. I mean, in all parts of the world, there's exercising udukkam, which is where the concept begins to travel. Because udukkam is central to the performance of self under capitalism, right? That you need to conform. And that is indeed how you belong, and that is how you're rewarded. So I think your question is really quite important in terms of what are our forms of political activity to be. And as we see the unconscionable massacre going on in Palestine, and you can see that increasingly all over the world, the huge disjuncture that is emerging between peoples and governments, right? As happened during the time of the huge, how shall I put it, the hoodwinking of populations during the time of the Iraq War, for example, right? And where populations emerged in militant way. Now, the question is this a solution? At the time of the Iraq War, it didn't matter, right? That millions and millions of people came out. I don't know whether it does matter that the farmers and students in India have been agitating, but those moments are preserved. They must not be understood only in their presentness. It's the futurity that they point towards. It's the exemplarity that they exercise for the future. So in that sense, for me, this militant activity is crucial, where it has to be a rebellion against the udukkam of neoliberalism, a reaction against the udukkam of capitalist self, or the molding of self under capitalism.
Thangam, you want to say something? Take another.
No, no, that was, my answer is yes.
To Peter then.
My question is for you, Thangam. First of all, I wanted to thank you for this really beautiful and inspiring talk and concept. While I was listening to your talk, I kept thinking, I hope this question is not too coarse or rough. I kept thinking that what you're saying about dormancy and this idea of a new practice of reading, to talk with the words of de Certeau, who was very keen on reinventing forms of reading, reading as poaching, for example. He has a beautiful text. So I kept thinking that what you're developing in terms of metabolic reading and dormancy is both so close and seems also so different from what has been traditionally called symptomatic reading on the one hand, and on the other hand, the whole logic of haunting, spectral history or presence. So I kept thinking, what exactly is the difference? So I felt like a tangential movement because you were always close to these traditions, and in a way I felt very also faithful to them. And at the same time, I kept thinking, okay, what you're saying is different. There is an important difference, and I kept wondering, so I don't even know if it's a question, I kept feeling that there is an important difference and that you're inventing something that is other. Thank you.
Do you want to take another? Amanda, is that enough?
Thanks so much. Those were just wonderful papers, both of them. I think I have a comment question for each. I'll start with Thangam because it follows directly on Peter, which is that it seemed to me that at the very beginning, when you were talking about the novel, you were engaging in a fairly familiar form of, you know, I kept thinking of like Said's culture and imperialism, right? You're seeing a certain kind of piece of evidence in the novel that speaks to a longer history of capitalism, let's just say, and colonialism, okay? But then it shifted profoundly, I think, you know, when you started talking about dormancy as a sort of an experiential thing for, you know, a psychological, lived, memory-related, trauma-related, yeah, you know, more sort of subjective. And so that's just a comment. And I guess the other question I had about your paper was not so much, you know, its relation to the symptomatic, but its relation to the latent and the manifest in Freud. And it seemed like in certain cases it was latency. And then that made me just wonder whether dormancy is a teleological term. Seed kind of invites that. But I don't think it is ultimately for you. So that's just a kind of like something, you know, if you have any thoughts about it, I'd like to hear. Dilip, I thought that was an amazing paper. Another kind of way in which I think the concept that you're talking about could be generalized beyond this notion of conformity to, again, a capitalist patriarchal world, would be as a form of norm policing. And then it would be something that could be much more broadly applied, shall we say, because I kept thinking, okay, so what are norm policing demotic terms that I can think of in relation to the various cultures and subcultures that I inhabit? And the only one I could think of off the bat, I know there are more, you know, like settle down and all that, but the first one I thought of was one that is in an academic one, or it is very linked to academic practices at the present time, which is stay in your lane. Mm-hmm. So I just think it's kind of worth thinking a little bit. I mean, I don't know if this is at all relevant to the way you're thinking, but it just seems like, and then the other thing I started thinking about was norm shattering. You know, how profoundly norm shattering has become something that is invoked in our own political present and is so linked to what is seen as the crisis of democracy, right? So those are just some sort of thoughts that I had, but I think partly what I'm trying to say is I think that the question of conformity and norm adherence and I don't even remotely, I'm not remotely suggesting you're saying this, but that there's a broad, highly differentiated, granular way to think about that, and we are all engaging in it all the time. We're not just like, we must be militant because, conformity is oppressing the world. I mean, sure, but we're also constantly norm policing and norm conforming in our own, in a whole range of worlds defined by different scales. So anyway, this is my thought.
Maybe Thangam, you take this one first. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for both those, very, very sort of sound and important questions. I don't think I can do justice to either of them, but I have been thinking, even in relation to others' paper, I was sort of thinking, is there a way in which one is moving away from, even if one continues to be sort of using some of the language of it, one is sort of moving away from a conception of the unconscious. So therefore, it is not quite symptomatic reading. It is not quite haunting. It is not quite latent. And in others, that My Bridge moment, actually, I was thinking that for My Bridge, those that chronophotography is revealing the optical unconscious, and one could have been hearing you as talking about a temporal unconscious in the slowing down of time that happens with the snail or with snail cinema. But at the same time, I think that was not quite it. And I sort of feel that there's a search here, maybe in both these projects, but I don't mean to speak for you, for something else that would be at the same time more temporalized, or whatever the word is.
Yeah.
And also more materialized, more material. But yet that material, I mean, for me, the interest in dormancy and in any concept in the end that I think with in relation to literature, and here I come back to Michael's question, is that there is a flickering between matter and metaphor with dormancy. So it's interesting that it is only as a metaphor that we can bring it back to describe what happens to our stories or our memories. But it is importantly also a way of rematerializing those stories and those memories. So there is a kind of circulation a strange feedback loop of metaphor and matter there that I find quite interesting. So yeah, that's all I feel I can say. And I look towards Ada as possibly being able to extend that, please.
I feel bad about them over things, but
We did co-teach a class together on something we could not understand and were trying to grasp, so we continue to do that.
well, I just feel like there's something really powerful in both of your concepts in a way that there's a kind of containment, or there's a question of the discrete, rather than being in the realm of gradation or a kind of continuous gradation. Because I don't know, I feel for me that there's like a kind of an impoverishment, say, in my model of these temporal rhythms, which are variegated, different from one another, but in a sense, it's all kind of gradations. And I'm curious about like what like this addition of things that are actually kind of discrete or contained or separate or actually defined in some sense, rather than in just this kind of continuum, if that makes sense. And I feel like there's something in both of your concepts that it's calling for a kind of containment, a kind of definition.
Right, and actually to kind of link what you said just now to the question that was asked, I mean, if you think about your snail, right? A snail contains itself, yet it moves, right? And which brings in the question of temporality that she raised. I mean, so the distinction between staticity and movement is a question of time, right? And I think that is important when we think about these concepts as well, because what you said about the ambiguity or the oscillation between meanings, right, is something that I was trying to bring out, where it's to go, to read through Foucault, to be a subject, to become a subject, right, and to have agency is to be subjected as well. So subject and subjection are part of the same process. And in that sense, here, when one talks about the udukam as the imposition of obedience on, there is also the experience of being obedient, which is, so again, it goes back to the question of temporality. There is this question of oscillation. And that's why I think your idea of dormancy, that of a state in between, right, is quite important when one thinks about concepts, when one thinks about being, when one thinks about politics, when one thinks about militancy, right? And we tend to see these as discrete moments rather than as continuities along a spectrum. Passivity, militancy, and so on. These are not permanent states; they are connected states. And so I think this. So if one were to think about the idea of dormancy in Sanskrit, it would be stambhanavastha, which is a pause, a moment of pause that is in between two states, right? So I think to think carefully about this, one has to recognize ambiguity, one has to recognize oscillation, and one has to recognize temporality, what happens with time, right? But the other thing that I was thinking of is, if you think about a very interesting word in Urdu, which is there in Arabic, which is there in Persian, the word awqat. Awqat is the idea of your assigned status, right? So if somebody is an upstart, if somebody gets out of line, you say, stay in your awqat, stay in the position that's assigned to you. But the word awqat in its etymology derives from the word waqt, which means time. Right? So awqat is related, so the question of status is also joined at the hip to the question of time, that this can be overturned, that the whole situation of power can be something quite different, where they that call upon you to stay within your awqat, you can tell them back that, what is your awqat that you can tell me to stay in my place, right? So I think it's this question of temporality and oscillation is crucial. And I think it was a wonderful juxtaposition putting us two together, because I think just this conversation with Thangam has been quite productive, because to think the idea of dormancy and of the the plane of meaning of words as they occupy a temporal space. Right?
I want to continue.
Please use the mic, Adi, and hold it close.
I would like to continue this line of thought of how you are related. So let me start with the episode of disciplining the soldier that you presented.
Yeah, the party member, yes.
Yeah. Or the party member. Let's replace the soldier with a shy child, a small child who is quite shy, and he is disciplined in this way. One possible reaction of the child is to cry. Another is just to stay silent and go to sleep. And I think that dormancy is like the degree zero of otukam. So containment, this is well maintained. but then there is the difference, and the important difference. In all your examples, there were agency on both sides. There is, discipline. There is someone who says something, and the other has to accept, etc. Dormancy, it seems to me, especially when you went to the, organic, biological realm, it seems like things that happens non-voluntarily. It's not that someone decides now to be dormant. It's not just that I decide that now I'm going to sleep or I'm not going to sleep. And in this way, there is, so the response it's too close. The response to this behave could be, no, I will go on strike. And strike will be quite similar to dormancy, no? It's a pause. It's a moment of stopping. But the voluntary element is, of course, makes all the difference. And let me carry it two more steps further. One is that translation, all the work of translation, of course, as we know, leaves traces of the untranslatable, or raise the traces of the untranslatable. But this is sending part of the world to sleep. It's when we use ideas today, who remembers that ideas are, really forms on the land, or piece of land, or piece of paper, etc. Translation is an exercise in forgetting, not just an exercise in understanding, because there is always part in case of the untranslatable words, encounter between two languages that are not easily translatable. There's always something that will be sent to oblivion, and then maybe resurrected in scholarship, etc. So I think that to think about translation with the dormancy is very productive, because there is untranslatability is always in part of the process of translation, and therefore, and the last thing I would like to say is that dormancy, unlike I think this behave, is not just a middle stage between, I don't remember, between two, you said pause between two. It's, especially in the biological and ecological context, it's a case of between life and death. Because it's not clear that this little guy would wake up. It's not clear at all. And so I would like you to bring this into the conversation about this.
Should we take the other questions, and then you can respond to both, to all sets? So, and then Sharon.
Thank you so much for your presentations. They're very, as all of them, so generative. My question is for Thangam. I really appreciated the way that you developed you describe what dormancy looks like in nature. But then when you think about it in regards to, humanity or human, right? You acknowledge that it doesn't completely translate, right? That when we think about the significance of dormancy for human beings, then you think about an interpretive practice, right? And the ways in which things are present in places that you may become aware of at different times, right? And in different moments. And it seems to me too that what you're calling dormancy is also just a feature of a phenomenological world, right? Which is not exhaustive when we try to describe it, but becomes sort of like the limit and also the possibility for new or just, I don't know, differently significant observations. And I wanted to ask though, what is the political problem or socio-political context as you imagine it, as you see it, as you could articulate it, that dormancy is the answer to, right? Like, what is their set of political problems or circumstances that dormancy becomes a means, that dormancy becomes an answer to? I guess that's what I'm asking. Especially, that's the question. Like, what's the problem?
Sure.
You know, I think in a way my question dovetails very much so with Ansley's, because I was thinking as I heard the talks and then kind of listened to the conversation about.
Could you use the mic, please?
Oh, yeah, sorry. About dormancy in the context of the passivity, the powerlessness that so many of us feel in the face of environmental problems, where we kind of poke our heads up. The world does not seem like a place where we can thrive. And then I was thinking about, well, to what extent does that sense of powerlessness and kind of falling back into a waking sleep reflect something like Thangam, you know, as our own internalized domination that is our own, but also reflects the domination of nature. And but then, you know, I was very struck by the way your talk closed with that beautiful quote about, you know, an unknown life surging forth, and Dilip's comments about, you know, the temporality of dormancy as not a permanent thing, but an ebb and flow, where dormancy, you know, holds the promise of something, of awakening. But then, you know, thinking about what something Adi said, that awakening is always uncertain. Will this little thing wake up again? We don't know for sure. So anyway, it seemed to me that this was one way of thinking about the eco-political aspects of both dormancy and Thangam.
Anyone else that I haven't seen? Oh, Chris, do you want to go?
Really enjoyed both. Oh, sorry. Really enjoyed both of them. Thank you. Thanks. The metabolic reading, love that. Would just love to hear more. And the word is a window. Thought that was really great. So I know y'all have a lot to think about. So those were just two phrases that came up and were struck with me. So I'd love to any mode of elaboration about either of those concepts, the metabolic reading and then the word as like a window into the culture and the political history.
Okay, so you have a lot, both leaders.
Thank you. These questions are so beautiful that I would almost rather end on those which bring me more clarity and also give me more to think through. But I'll just say a few words. I mean, I suppose the fact that one may not wake up from dormancy, that it's a question of life or death, is precisely the stakes that I am keeping in mind throughout, and in the sense that that this can happen to histories and causes and ideas or conceptions of world that can die. So I guess that's the answer also to the question of the politics of this, in the sense, what political situation or challenge or peril, is this an answer too? I don't think it's a particular content. I think it's more maybe something closer to what Jason Stanley yesterday was describing as a logic of erasure. So dormancy as an answer to that, which may be a way of saying some things may seem erased, but we are in relation to them but we are sort of, we are merely dormant in relation to them, or they are merely dormant in relation to us. There is still some kind of dialectic, or rather maybe metabolics, by which one would reanimate some of this. And I'm obviously terrible at Q&A, but the last thing I would say would be something like, yes, it remains phenomenological in the sense that if dormancy in nature does have to do with the critical danger of death, but also the need to save energy, what one could think, this is where it is metabolic, but this is where one could try to bring the notion of energy to sort of political thinking and action, in the sense that energy saving is not only some kind of conservative thing, or a kind of retreat from the political, but it might be a way of sort of potentializing certain things. And I want to actually end by saying that uncannily, I mean, concepts paired together here often do weird and fascinating things, but in this case, I want to add that Dilip's Otukam, and in fact, the language that he draws that from, is my ancestral language that is dormant in me. So
should suddenly speak in tongues.
or I should have kissed you before your talk.
That would have been most pleasant.
In a brief.
So to keep with that frisson that has been introduced by Thangam, to think about translation and what is lost, I mean, there is this idea that somehow that engagement that one has with a word, there is a lot that is lost in meaning, and that's a very monogamous idea, right? I mean, if you think about the promiscuity, the multiple kisses that that word receives over the course of a lifetime, there is an expansion of meaning and a realization of polymorphous perverse selves, as it were. The word in each translation, in the promiscuous engagement that is had with it, begins to acquire greater and greater meaning. The example that you began with about the child at the moment of rebuke, and I was just thinking about the historical and the anthropological ways in which ritual is looked at, right? In anthropology, ritual is looked at as a moment of, it's a self-contained moment which recurs, and it recurs without difference. So you imagine a child who is rebuked, and the child, according to the temperament, may at that moment choose to rebel, may say nothing, may cry, storm out, etc., etc. But I think there is this connection with a longer life that we need to look at, so that historical attitude to ritual always looks beyond the moment of ritual, right? And looks at how that moment of ritual has informed the person who then, when he or she engages in the next ritual, is already transformed, and so on and so forth. So I think that is the idea of temporality in terms of trying to think with concepts, trying to think with translation. And so that I think this question of the pause, we tend to think about it as a stasis, but it's probably dormancy is the moment of formation, as we know with seeds, right? And it's important not to think too much with the idea of stasis and more with the idea of futurity, right? And which goes back to the child and so on and so forth. But I think this question of futurity is central, You know, when we think about politics, when we think about Udukam, the ways in which people refashion themselves despite their subjection. You know, and this process of becoming a subject is not like, you know, a moonshot. That it's something that's constantly happening in different contexts. It's transient, conjunctural, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I'll stop.
A lot to sleep over. Thank you. Conclude the panel.